Good morning. Whoa, that's loud. How is everyone this morning? Doing all right? Looks a little bleary-eyed out there. I can't imagine why. My name's Bryan, and so glad to be here with you this morning. It's my privilege to bring God's word to you this morning. So if you have a Bible with you, whether that's a hard copy or on a device, we are going to be starting off in Philippians chapter 2. I don't know, anyone faced any obstacles this week at all? Just maybe one, two, maybe a little bit, one here or there, right? I mean, we all face obstacles in our lives, don't we? That's just kind of part of life. And sometimes it seems like we get past one obstacle and we think, oh, plain sailing now, right? And lo and behold, another obstacle comes along, doesn't it? And sometimes the second obstacle doesn't even have the decency to wait for the first obstacle to be gone past, does it? It just kind of piles in on top of the first obstacle, gate crashing in on that. But it's kind of how we face obstacles that matters, isn't it? We're kind of talking about, I've been using running as a kind of illustration through this series. And why stop now, right? So the first really long 100-miler I did was down in Ashland in southern Oregon. And it was about the last 15 miles of the race, I should say, not 50. And it was kind of this long, steep, downhill section, right? And my quads had kind of given out, so I was kind of running slowly, just wanted to make it to the end. And this other runner, he caught up with me, and we were chatting, and then he went off in front of me. And about a minute or two later, I heard this like shouting and whooping and hollering and stuff going on down in the woods. But the woods were thick enough that I couldn't really see what was going on down there. A few miles later, there was an aid station, and he happened to be at the aid station. He hadn't left yet when I got there. And so I said, hey, what was all that about? And he said, well, shortly after I left you, I caught up with a runner who was just in front of you. And I could see that he was running down the trail, down this steep hill, and there were 3 bears after him. And he said, I had to shout at him to stop, right? And we stopped, and we turned around, and we put our hands up in the air and waved, and talked to the bears, and that stopped them from chasing us, and it was all good. And a couple of thoughts crossed my mind. Firstly, I was glad that it wasn't me down there. And secondly, I was glad that I didn't know exactly what had happened down there, because I might not have gone on down. And sometimes we face obstacles, don't we, that have us on the run and want to chase us and want to devour us. And sometimes they just lie in front of us and we kind of have to work out how to get around them. And sometimes the obstacles are actually in us too, aren't they? You know, I don't know if the Apostle Paul was ever chased by bears or not. I know that he fought in Ephesus with wild animals. I don't know exactly what that was all about. We can ask him sometime when we get there. But we do know that he faced a lot of obstacles. In fact, everywhere he went, he faced obstacles. Sometimes those obstacles were very apparent. Sometimes those obstacles weren't so apparent. And some of the problems and obstacles that Paul faced, we might think, well, that's not really what I face today. And maybe not. But as the author of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun, right? It's just the same obstacles with new people, right? Maybe they're dressed up slightly differently, but same obstacles, new people, just rebranded. And so what obstacles are you facing this morning? And how are you going to get past them? Well, let's see if we can find out. Janelle's going to come up and she's going to read Philippians chapter 2, verse 19 to 3, 4,
I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with him, and I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. I've thought it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all, and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor, such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same thing to you is no trouble to me and is safe for you. Look out for the dogs. Look out for the evildoers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh. For we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also.
So a few years after that race in Ashland, I was out in the Ochicos, which is kind of just near Prineville, and I used to run out there quite a bit. And it was early morning, right, and I was running up this trail and minding my own business, kind of, lost in my own thoughts. And suddenly I heard this crashing noise in the woods, like 15 yards away to my left. And as I looked over to see what that was all about, I saw this big black face start peering up at me. And then this face got taller as the bear stood up on its haunches, right? And at the same time, I could hear another noise, like something going up a tree, and I instinctively knew what that was, that this was a sow, and she had a cub going up a tree, which I also knew is like, yeah, that's not the best situation to be in. And this bear started making this snorting noise at me, right? And I don't know much about bear language, but I reckon that was probably not a great sign. So my instinct was to leg it as fast as I could up the trail. But I remembered all, the years previously to what had happened in Ashland. And so I did not do that. And I stopped, and I stood, and I faced the bear, and I put my arms up high, right? And I started to just speak to the bear. Hey, bear, it's just me, just out here for my run in the morning, don't take no attention to me, and that kind of stuff, right? And eventually, after a couple of minutes or so, the bear, she lowered herself back down, and she still had her eyes on me, and I sort of inched my way up the trail, until I was out of sight, and then I legged it as fast as I could, right? The Apostle Paul, he is desperate to know if what he's told the church has been applied by them, right? That's the one thing that he really, really wants to know. Because he knows that they will face obstacles. He knows how they can get past them, right? He knows that when he was with them, that he told them what it would take to get past the obstacles. But the problem is now, right, he isn't there with them anymore. And the question is, what will they do when he is not there with them? Will they actually be able to turn and face those obstacles in the same way that he told them how to do that? Or will they just try and run away as fast as they can. Because now they're on their own, what will they do? Has any transformation actually taken place in their lives? And we saw last week that when Paul was talking about being worried, right, that he had run in vain, that he had labored in vain, that when he got to meet the Lord, he would have nothing to show for his work and for his effort. And what was he going to show the Lord for his work and his effort? Well, it's the Philippians themselves, right? That not only had they received Christ, that they'd been saved by Christ, but that they were also transformed in Christ. And they were starting to live life Christ's way. So here is the key, I think, about whether we face our obstacles in the right way or not. And I think there's 3 words. In the Lord. In the Lord. How do we see obstacles? Do we see them in the Lord? Or do we see them out of the Lord? Because I think when we see them in the Lord, it's pretty amazing how the obstacles kind of just shrink away and down, don't they? But when we see the obstacles outside of the Lord, well, they become overwhelming and enormous and beyond anything that we control. That's not to say when we see obstacles in the Lord that they just, that they disappear. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think when we see obstacles in the way, in the Lord, then we have a completely different view of them. So the first obstacle that I think that Paul and the Philippians faced was the obstacle of isolation. We have to remember here that Paul is under house arrest. And he is basically isolated. Yes, he was chained to a soldier 24/7, right? And yes, other people could come to him and had access to him. But you remember, he had been in this situation for a long time. Because before he got to Rome, he had been in prison for 2 years in Caesarea. And then he'd been sent to Rome, and that had taken many months for him to get to Rome. And then Luke tells us that in Acts that he was in Rome under house arrest for another 2 years. 4 years, plus the voyage to Rome. That is a long, long period of time. That's an obstacle. And the obstacle is that Paul was isolated from his churches. He could no longer do his missionary journeys, going around his churches, encouraging his churches, equipping his churches, discipling his churches. And his churches were isolated from him. It was a big obstacle. If you want to run long distances, you better like solitude. Because you're going to spend a lot of time by yourself. Now, if you're an introvert like me, that's not much of a problem, right? I can spend a lot of time by myself, and that's fine. Not to say that I don't like being around other people, because I do like that too. But, and if you're an extrovert, you might think, well, that's not so appealing, right? To spend all that time by yourself. Although it's good for all of us, I would suggest that we have some solitude in life and get alone with God. But there's a difference between solitude and isolation. Because I think of solitude as being voluntary, right? I voluntarily go out into the woods and run by myself. But isolation is often something that is kind of forced on us. It was forced on Paul. He didn't want to be isolated. That was the situation that he was in. I think of solitude actually leads to flourishing, whereas isolation actually leads to decline. And you might say, well, Paul wasn't isolated. He had lots of people around him, right? He was chained to a soldier 24/7. And he had other people that could come and see him. But it's not the same thing, is it? I mean, you can live in a city like Portland and be surrounded by people and still feel isolated. In fact, that isolation can feel worse than if you're just out in the woods by yourself, right? Because he was cut off from community. We get prayer requests passed on to us from He Gets Us. And I would say like 80% of those prayer requests have to do with loneliness and isolation. And isolation can just appear out of nowhere too. You may remember the story of the prophet Elijah, who was the prophet in Israel, and he had this battle with Ahab and Jezebel and the prophets of Baal, and they had this competition to see who could call on their God to call fire down from heaven to burn the sacrifice, right? And the prophets of Baal went first, and of course they failed miserably, no matter what they did. And then Elijah went, and he even poured tons of water over the sacrifice just to give it some extra emphasis. And he asked God, and fire, straight down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice. And prior to that, Elijah had prayed for a drought, and that drought had been 3 years long. After he won the competition, he prayed again, and God sent rain, and Elijah ran before the chariot of Ahab back to town. But the next day, Ahab's wife, who was not that very nice of a woman, Jezebel, she heard about all this, and she put a hit out on Elijah. And Elijah, suddenly, from this great victorious prophet, he ran as fast as he could because he saw this obstacle as something that couldn't be overcome, even though he just had this great victory the day before, right? And I think that's what happens when we don't see obstacles in the Lord. And when we don't see obstacles in the Lord, it drives us into isolation. In fact, when Elijah got out into the wilderness and God met him in the wilderness, in solitude, he asked Elijah, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah explained that he was the only prophet left of the Lord. Which actually wasn't true. And God pointed that out to him. He said, no, actually, I've got quite a few others. And that's always been the case. In fact, it had been pointed out to Elijah before. And that's what the enemy of our souls would love for us to do, to drive us into isolation, away from God and away from each other, by getting our hearts and our minds on the obstacle instead of in the Lord. And let's face it, today, it's easy for that to happen because we're surrounded by news 24/7. And it's all about what? Obstacles. It's all about what's wrong and what's bad. Or maybe we get isolated even by our own busyness and the schedules that we have in our lives. And we let that overwhelm us. Or perhaps sometimes it's our past, our failures that we look back on, our disappointments that we don't feel good enough, or guilt. What can we do? Well, we can do what Paul does. We can send for good news. We can send for good news. Because Paul says that he is going to send Timothy to the Philippians. And why is he going to send Timothy to the Philippians? Because Paul says he's got no one else like him, no one else that has genuine concern for the Philippians like Timothy. That everybody else is looking after their own interests, but only Timothy has that genuine concern. I'm assuming actually here that Paul is not talking about Luke and Silas and those people. He's talking about the people we talked about in chapter 1 who were doing things for their own interest. And he says that Timothy is like a son. And how is Timothy like a son? Because he shares the same interests as Paul does. His interest is in the Lord. It's not in his own interest, it's in the Lord. I heard this conversation one time, these people were talking about I don't understand why people keep going back to church. I mean, you hear that once, right, or twice, and you get it, right? You don't need it any more than that. That's it, right? And I'm thinking, no, not really. And why do we need to keep hearing it? Because we need good news, don't we? We need to keep hearing the good news. We need to be cheered up. I don't know about you, but I need to be cheered up this morning. I need to hear the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we need community with people who are genuinely concerned about us. And that genuine concern comes through the gospel of Jesus Christ. People who are looking not after their own interests, but into the interests of the Lord. And even when we might be feeling imprisoned and like obstacles are overwhelming, I like to hear about how God is working in your life and the good news that you bring here this morning about how God is working in your life. And it gives me hope, and it reminds me that the obstacle I face when I see it in the Lord is really not much of an obstacle at all. And ultimately, the obstacle that really keeps us isolated is a sin. That is the obstacle that keeps us looking after our own interests, that keeps us from God himself. But Jesus came to overcome that obstacle. And he is the only one that can overcome that obstacle. And he isolated that obstacle, our sin, when he took it to the cross and he died and he buried it once and for all, so that when he is resurrected, and he is resurrected, and he promises that same good news for us today, and that should cheer us all up, right? That we too are resurrected as well. That the sin in our lives is no longer an obstacle. And we keep reminding ourselves of the only one who has real, genuine concern for us, so much so that he would die on a cross. Paul, writing to the Colossians, says, and you who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. We overcome the obstacle of isolation when we send out for good news in the Lord. The second obstacle I think Paul and the Philippians have here is one dealing with expectations. Paul says that he hopes to send Timothy when he sees what the outcome is going to be. That's his expectation. He's not certain about it, but that's what he hopes. And meanwhile, the Philippians, they've sent this chap, Epaphroditus, and they sent him to Paul with a gift, right? A financial gift, because we have to remember that when Paul was under house arrest, the Romans didn't pay for any of that. You're on your own, pal. And so he was reliant on people supporting them. And the Philippians, they want to support Paul, so they send this bloke Epaphroditus with a financial gift. And I think the idea is that Epaphroditus would then stay on and help minister to Paul. But unfortunately, it doesn't quite go to plan, does it? Because Epaphroditus gets sick. In fact, he almost dies, Paul says. And instead of ministering to Paul, Paul ends up having to minister to him. And Epaphroditus, in fact, becomes more of a burden to Paul, and that's not what they expected at all. And the Philippians have heard about Epaphroditus and how he's become sick, and they're concerned about that. And now it's even more of a burden on Paul and on Epaphroditus. And the whole thing hasn't really worked out as everyone expected. And so Paul sends him back, and he kind of writes in glowing terms about Epaphroditus in case the Philippians think that he's just been a failure or something. But the point is, expectations, right? They'll get you every time. Again, going back to running, so when you run long distance races, there are aid stations every I don't know, 7 to 10 miles or so. And the one thing you want to know at an aid station is, how far is it to the next one? That's all you really want to know. So this one race I was running, and they said, oh, it's really short. It's not that far. It's only 6 miles. It's about 8 or 9 miles down the trail, and I hadn't seen any aid station. And it was, I don't know, probably 27 hours into the race, and it's tired, and your mind kind of does funny things when you're that tired. And it's like, where is this place, right? Because I should have seen it ages and ages ago, and just sat down in utter despair on this rock. I thought I'd missed it, gone wrong, whatever it had been, and it was just terrible. Because it really matters where we get our expectations from, doesn't it? And it really matters that our expectations are right. Because if we're thinking things are going to work out this way, and we really think that's the way it's going to work, and then they don't, it's just defeating, isn't it? It can be soul-crushing at times. And that's sometimes my problem. Like, I'm kind of optimistic, and I think, oh, this is going to be great, and it's going to work out like this, right? And then it doesn't work out like that, and it's just like, poof, and just feel crushed. And I do that to myself. I set high expectations for myself too. No one's more of a critic of me than I am. And sometimes, like on that trail, you're given wrong expectations. Or expectations maybe that don't fit your situation. I've been to innumerable like church conferences and seminars and stuff. And that's all good, right? And of course, one of the reasons that pastors go to these things is because we want to hear how these successful pastors have done church, right? And of course, that's what they have, successful pastors. And they share about how their church has grown, from 2 people to 50,000 people. And this is what we did, right? And if you go back to your church and do this, your church will do the same. And so all these pastors rush back to their churches, and me included, like, right, let's going to do this. And we start implement the plans and things, right? And then it doesn't happen. Or not 50,000, maybe 5 people, right? And it's like, oh. And here's the thing too, is that you think, well, I've done all that was right, that they said to do, so what must be wrong? Well, it must be me. Must be me. And of course, the problem is, we come back with wrong expectations, don't we? Because it's not necessarily the same context, the same culture, any of those things. It's different. We haven't taken any of that into account. And it matters that we have the right expectations. Because before Jesus came to earth, what did people think about the Messiah and how he would come? Did they think that the Messiah would be humble? Did they think that the Messiah was going to live a peasant life? Did they think the Messiah was going to associate with sinners? That he would touch the untouchables? That he would die on a cross? No. They thought he would be a king. They thought he would ride in victorious. They thought that he would restore Israel back to its former glory, just when David was king, right? They thought that he would drive out those horrible Romans, right? Not heal their servants. And they certainly didn't think that he would die on a cross. They didn't think that he would minister to sinners. They thought he would focus on the righteous. Those were the expectations. And they missed Jesus. In fact, Jesus was an obstacle. He was a stumbling block. He was a rock of offense. But we need to notice what Paul says when he says that he hopes to send Timothy. He hopes to send Timothy in the Lord. His expectation, you see, is in the Lord. That's where he's looking for his expectation. And he thinks and he trusts that he's going to be released, right? That's his expectation. But he trusts who? In the Lord. His expectation lies in the Lord. The Philippians are to welcome Epaphroditus back, and they are to receive him in who? The Lord. Because, despite it being the expected outcome, right, our real expectation is in the Lord. It's in the Lord. Paul's expectation is in the Lord. It's not in a specific outcome one way or the other. He might think it might go one way or the other, but ultimately his expectation is in the Lord. And maybe I'm sounding a bit redundant here, but it's what we need, isn't it? That our expectation is in the Lord. It's June right now, isn't it? My expectation is there might be some sunshine and less rain. Apparently not, but my expectation is in the Lord. We had a wonderful evening last night with the Starlight Parade coming past here, and we're out here with a canopy and chatting with some people and just being, the presence of the church outside the building here. And it was fantastic. And a bit later, we're going to do some prayer walking, if you would want to come and join us. And we have some thoughts and ideas and some plans about maybe focusing on this block and the neighborhood around us and some things that we want to do. But our expectation is in the Lord. Now, we should expect the Lord to do things, right? But the outcome is up to him. Yes, we have to be faithful and do our part, right? But our expectation is in the Lord. And some of you are going to graduate soon, and some of you are in transition in life and new chapters, and that's really exciting, and you probably have some expectations about where that's leading, but some of that will work out, and maybe some of it won't, but the expectation is in the Lord. One of the best known verses in the Bible, which is quoted a lot and written on coffee cups and all that kind of stuff, it is from the prophet Jeremiah, right? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. And that's a great verse, isn't it? And it's full of expectation. But we have to be a little bit cautious, don't we? Because we start filling it with our expectation, and we forget about the context that Jeremiah wrote that. He was addressing the people of Jerusalem, who their expectation was that God was going to protect them and keep them safe and keep Jerusalem standing firm. But actually, God's expectation was no, he wasn't. He was going to let the Babylonians come in and raze Jerusalem to the ground, and they were all going to be dragged off to Babylon in exile for 70 years. That's why it's so important, isn't it, that we keep our expectations in the Lord. It matters. The final obstacle that Paul addresses here is additions. He says to watch out for the dogs and evildoers, for those who mutilate the flesh. He's not talking about people looking after their own interests here. He's actually talking about people who don't preach the gospel. And it's kind of stunning, frankly, because, the Jews would talk about Gentiles as being dogs outside of being the people of God, right? But here, Paul flips it the other way around, right? And saying, actually, they're the dogs, and even Gentiles who put their faith in Christ are the true believers. And he's against them because they make additions to in the Lord. living in Central Oregon for many years and running for many years, all kinds of obstacles out there. And the obstacle actually that I really dislike the most is not bears or cougars, but snakes. I hate rattlesnakes. And there are tons and tons of rattlesnakes out there. I've seen them loads of time. And that with the bears and the cougars and everything else out there, I started wondering if running in the Lord was sufficient, right? That maybe I needed to take some other kind of protection along with me. Now, whether it's prudent or not to carry additional protection when you're out on the trail, I'll leave that up for you to decide. But what about life's obstacles? Is being in the Lord enough, right? When we face those obstacles on the trail, when we see them running after us and wanting to devour us, is our faith in the Lord enough? Or are we tempted to start, well, maybe I need something more. Maybe I need to add something else because maybe being in the Lord isn't quite enough. Which is kind of what Paul was addressing, right, with these Jews. They said, yeah, well, being in the Lord is all very well, but maybe you need something more tangible, like, circumcision or rituals or doing this and doing that. And we could be tempted the same way, right? Instead of talking about the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we go, yeah, that, and you need to come to church every day of the week, or you need to do this, or you need to do that, or you need to be in missions, and you need to do, and all of that is good, and it's what we should be doing, but it comes as a result of us being in the Lord, not as an addition, right? It comes as a result. Faith in the Lord. There's nothing greater that we can add to than being in the Lord. There is nothing we can do more than just to be in the Lord. One time, Jesus had a conversation with a Samaritan woman at a well, and eventually the conversation got around to about where the right place was to worship God. And she said, well, as a Samaritan, we think that God is to be worshipped on Mount Gerizim, right? And you Jews, you think that God is to be worshipped in Jerusalem. But when the Messiah comes, he'll sort it all out, right? Little did she know that she was actually talking to the Messiah. And Jesus, he affirms that the true place to worship God was in Jerusalem. But then he goes on to say, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. In other words, what Jesus is saying, no additions required. Doesn't matter where you worship in spirit, in truth. Worship in the Lord. Anyone facing an obstacle here this morning? We're all facing obstacles, right? And the question is, how are you going to deal with it? How are you going to see the obstacle? With what lens are you going to look at it through? Are you going to look at it through in the Lord? And are you going to put into practice maybe what you have heard? Or are you going to allow yourself to become isolated? Are you going to have expectations that are just kind of, they might be great, right? But they're not the Lord's expectations. Or maybe you're trying to make additions in your life this morning. We all need to turn right now and be in the Lord. And maybe you came here this morning hoping for some good news. Well, I hope you've heard some good news this morning, because the good news that we all need to hear every day, sometimes multiple times during the day, if you're like me, is the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ overcame that obstacle that keeps us from God, our sin. And he nailed it to a cross and he buried it. And we are raised together with him in new life because we are in the Lord. And if you've never received him, I would encourage you now this morning to turn to the Lord and be in the Lord and ask him to receive you. And maybe you have some expectations this morning that you just kind of go, yeah, that's not really in the Lord. And you just need to give that to him. Or maybe you've made some additions and you just kind of need to subtract them, right? And take them away. We're going to take communion shortly. David's going to come up and play another song.